Hello. In this video, I'm going to look at David Hume's criticisms of the design argument. So this will be useful for you if you're doing A-level religious studies. This is particularly pitched at people doing AQA, but it'll be useful for other boards too. So welcome. If you've not watched any of my videos before, please subscribe to the channel because there's going to be lots more coming up and there's lots there already. But what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to take you through Hume's criticisms of design arguments in general. We're not going to evaluate them in this video, we're just going to get a good handle on what they are, and evaluating comes as the next step. Okay, so really important point you need to remember when you're writing about this. Because the design argument is Paley's, it can be really tempting to say Hume criticises Paley or Hume says that Paley is wrong. You need to not do that because we've got a historical problem. Hume actually came first. He died before Paley even published Natural Theology, which is the book in which he lays out the design argument. But design arguments weren't really anything new. Paley's formulation was a little bit new, but design arguments go all the way back to Aquinas and even before that. So Hume's criticising design arguments in general, and his criticisms certainly apply to Paley, but he wasn't criticising Paley directly. So you need to make sure you just don't say that in your writing. So Hume sets out these criticisms in a book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And you won't be asked about this in the exam, but it's useful to know and it's quite interesting to know. Hume held views that suggest that he was an atheist or something pretty close to being an atheist. But he might not have been taken seriously if he'd been very open about that, because the church still held a lot of power in the 1700s. So when this book was published in 1779, it takes the form of a discussion, like a dialogue, which is why it's called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, between three fictional philosophers. So Hume essentially makes up three characters. And you don't need to know who they are particularly, but Philo, who's the skeptical one, the kind of non-believer, he's articulating Hume's own views. So this was kind of a clever way of Hume getting his message across of what he thought without getting himself in trouble. And we've just got a little quote here, which will give you a flavour of what Hume thinks about design arguments. This world, for all he knows, is very faulty and imperfect compared to a superior standard, and was only the first rude essay of some infant deity who abandoned it afterwards. So that's kind of a response to somebody who might say the world is very beautiful, it's very ordered, it's very suitable for us, this must be the work of a designer god. That's essentially what Paley's saying. This is Hume in the dialogues saying, well, how do we know it's so great? For all we know, this is actually a very, very imperfect world, and maybe it's just like a first draft of a god who's much less great than the god that maybe people are imagining. So that just gives you an idea of how skeptical he is about design arguments. Let's get into it properly then. So criticism number one. Hume is willing to go as far as admitting that design suggests that there might be a designer. So suppose the universe was designed. This would mean that we've got a designer, but it doesn't prove that the designer is God. So what Hume's not happy about here is the idea that not only is there a designer, but that it's definitely the God of classical theism, the Christian God. Hume disputes that. He says even if there is a designer, it could have been something much lesser. It could have not just been one designer, it could have been a team, lesser gods, limited gods, or even a first attempt by a being who's moved on to more impressive things. So, you know, maybe the first draft of some sort of junior god. Hume's not saying that these things are definitely true, but he's saying they're possible. And if we're willing to believe they're possible, then that undermines Paley's view that it has to be the god of classical theism. But remember, Hume isn't criticising Paley directly because he wouldn't have known about Paley in his book. So let's just break this down a little bit further. Machines, like Paley's watch, aren't usually designed and made by only one person. There'll be a whole process, lots of different people will contribute, different people will design different bits of it, and then it'll all come together. So Hume knew that, and he was saying that arguments like this one, like analogical arguments, are flawed, because why are we assuming that there would only be one universe maker? We wouldn't probably think, if we found a watch, that it would only have had one watchmaker, that there could only be one watchmaker. So why would we assume the same of the universe? And then this one goes a little bit deeper. It could have been a lesser being, like we mentioned before. It's illogical. It's too much of a jump to claim that it must be the God of classical theism. It must be the Christian God. So if Hume's right, if we imagine that the universe is actually the work of a lesser God, like a junior God, maybe a God doing the first draft of a piece of coursework, what grade would you give it? Is the universe actually that great? Is it that wonderful that it must only have been made by a perfect God? Hume doesn't think so, and that leads us into criticism number 2. This is about the actual nature of the design. So the world around us is far from perfect. We know this because we can see suffering and we experience suffering. But Christians claim that the God who made it is perfect and unlimited in every way. So that gives us a problem, because if the design is perfect, why isn't the design perfect? Surely that suggests that God either made mistakes, which a perfect God wouldn't do, or that God actively designed in things like suffering, which would suggest that that's not a good God. And in either case, it doesn't appear to be the God that Christians believe in. That one will get fleshed out much more when you look at the problem of evil, but that's enough for us to be going on with for now. Criticism number 3, this is where Hume doesn't like the idea of an analogy. So he thinks it's a bad analogy to say the world is like a machine. He doesn't agree that the world is like a machine, because machines are artificial. He sees the world as natural. And because we're talking about the world, we can also talk about the universe in these terms. It's much more like an animal or a vegetable than a machine. So Hume looks at the world, he looks at the universe, and he doesn't see something mechanical. He sees a living thing, and living things grow and develop on their own. They don't tend to be put together. So he thinks it makes more sense to say that the world and the universe grew and developed of its own accord than to say it was constructed, put together, manufactured, designed. Let me flesh this one out for you a little bit. So Paley's comparing the universe to a machine, but Hume got there first and argued that it's not really like a machine, it's more like a living thing. And living things can grow and change by themselves, but a watch can't. Once a watch is made, it doesn't grow and change anymore unless somebody changes it. But living things do grow and change by themselves. And Hume's ahead of his time here, because he wouldn't have known Darwin's theory of evolution. But Darwin's theory of evolution, which we now pretty much accept as being largely true, suggests that actually, yeah, the world and the universe is organic. It is more like a living thing than it is like a machine. And it grows and changes without anything making it do that. It happens naturally. We're doing well. Let's have a look at number 4. This is about what we can know. So Hume's problem here is he doesn't think humans have sufficient knowledge or experience of the creation of the world or the creation of the universe to conclude anything about the designer. So again, his problem here is with the analogy itself. We've got experience of what we can design, but we don't know the first thing about how God would have gone about it. So to say humans do it this way, therefore God must also have done it this way, that's anthropomorphism. That's explaining things that we don't understand in human terms. And Hume doesn't think you should do that. To flesh it out a bit more, our knowledge of the world is too limited to make judgments about it as a whole. Our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of the universe. We know some things, and you could argue we know more than Hume would have done, but we still can't make big sweeping judgments because we don't have all the information. So what I think he's really saying here is we only know how humans design things, and even if there is a God, and even if God is a designer, saying that we know how humans do it doesn't tell us anything about how God would do it. So because we don't know that, we can't draw an analogy. We can't say that these things are similar because we don't know enough. This, like I said, is called anthropomorphism, and it's philosophically not great because we end up explaining things in human terms that don't really work in human terms. One more. Now, this is what we call the Epicurean hypothesis, and Hume got this from the thinking of Epicurus, who was an ancient Greek thinker. And you can think about this as just maybe we got lucky. Maybe the universe could have ordered itself just by chance. If the universe is, as Epicurus thought and as Hume possibly thought, a collection of just stuff, of constantly changing atoms, eventually it will order itself into something that makes sense. Now, we've got a modern version of this as well, which is called multiverse theory, which, to make a long story short, is the idea that there are lots and lots and lots and lots, billions of universes kind of existing all at once in parallel. We can't observe other universes, but they might be there. If that's true, then every possible universe will exist at some point, which means that the one we're in has to exist at some point. To try and make this a bit more real for you, think about it this way. If you had 12 dice and kept throwing them an infinite number of times, eventually you'd get 12 sixes. It might take a really, 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 really long time, but you would get them in the end. Maybe the universe is like that. Maybe it's the case that it's just constantly reshuffling itself over an endless amount of time, and sometimes it ends up chaotic and sometimes it ends up ordered. But when it ends up ordered, it's not because a designer has made it that way. It's just that's the roll of the dice. All right, so that's a little summary for you. Here what I've done is I've just boiled each one down into a sentence. This isn't good for writing essays, but it is good for just learning what each one means, and then you can build it back up to help you write an essay. So firstly, design may equal designer, but designer doesn't equal God. That's too much of a leap. Secondly, the design is imperfect, which suggests the designer was too, which in Hume's view means that it couldn't have been the God of classical theism. Thirdly, the universe is more like a living thing than a machine, so making an analogy with a machine is a bit flawed. Fourthly, the analogy of a human designer is anthropomorphism. Just because we know how a human would design doesn't mean we can say anything meaningful about how God would design or how a divine thinker would design. And lastly, we don't need to bring in a designer because it's possible that the universe could have ended up this way just by chance. All right, I hope that's been helpful. I'm going to do more videos on some year one content. So if you're new to the A level, like I say, please subscribe to the channel, look out for new videos. I hope that's been really helpful. Work hard, and I'll see you soon.